The Fellowship of the Great Physician welcomes you to House Call. Our hosts today are doctors of chiropractic, Dr. Gerald Lala and Dr. Richard Jensen, who is also a board-certified acupuncturist, practice independently in North Oaks, Minnesota. Let's join our hosts for today's program that will assist you in your quest for optimum health and well-being.
Welcome to House Call. I'm Dr. Gerald Lala.
I'm Dr. Richard Jensen.
Wonderful to have you with us, and today we're going to talk about an issue, as it says on your television screen there, irritable bowel syndrome. And boy, a lot of people have intestinal problems, and many of them are taking prescribed drugs for them, and that's fine, but there are some natural alternatives to irritable bowel syndrome, sometimes referred to leaky bowel syndrome. And how could that be? Well, what we eat really determines our intestinal health, and our intestinal health really greatly affects our systemic health, the health throughout our body. And if our bowels are not functioning properly, we're not going to digest our foods correctly, and therefore we're not going to absorb the foods and vitamins and minerals and proteins and carbohydrates and fats that we need for health. So if the bowels aren't functioning correctly, we're not going to have good health. Now you may say, gee, I've got good intestinal health, I don't have any problems with my bowels, but I do have fibromyalgia, or I've got chronic headaches, or I've got the skin problems, I've got arthritic problems. Well, often those issues really go back to the intestinal system, to the gastrointestinal system. Often they're not looked at because in our society, our medical society today, we specialize, like as chiropractic physicians, we've been trained to specialize in the spine and nervous system, muscle, skeletal problems. The only difference with us is that we've chosen to expand our horizon within our scope of practice and look at the person from a whole person perspective. Plus, we have chosen not to indiscriminately prescribe or recommend food supplements to people without proper diagnostic testing, because each of us has an individual biochemical nature. Therefore, he may need calcium and I may need calcium, that's true, but the need for his body has to be somewhat different than the need of calcium in my body, and that goes along with everybody. So by looking at the gastrointestinal system and employing proper diagnostic tests, you can often be very specific and therefore often more positive results to those people. So this program was really prompted by many, many letters. This is a very common one, and we do invite your letters and telephone calls, and if you have any questions for specific information about specific health problems or specific diagnostic tests, they're going to bring the telephone number up for you later. Now, dear doctors, my medical doctor says I have an intestinal infection. He calls it irritable bowel syndrome. He's tried several drugs, but they don't help. I'm not any better. Could you help me? Well, Dr. Jensen, why don't you discuss that first thing? Could I really contact an intestinal infection? I thought that the only problem was in developing companies and for travelers.
Thank you, Dr. Lala. Well, certainly there are different causes of or ways that we can be exposed to an intestinal infection. First of all, there's food handling, and if food handling is done incorrectly, we can increase our risk by not washing our hands while preparing things, such as that can spread a lot of disease that way. Of say like chicken is just at the right chemical nature for bad bacteria to proliferate through it. Also, we increase that exposure by putting ourselves in other people's hands by going out and dining out. There's also antibiotic use. Antibiotic use, everybody has a spectrum of flora that's in their gut, and there are natural balances that have occurred throughout time, and hopefully you're in a state of balance. It's called eubiosis. And what that states is that the good bacteria keep the bad bacteria at bay, generally because it's just a fight for food substances that are going through there and for territory. And so hopefully the good bacteria, the ones that work symbiotically with you, are winning that fight. And so what happens though is with antibiotic use, you wipe out, if it's a broad spectrum antibiotic, you wipe out the good with the bad. But the problem is you wipe out bacteria, and it leaves the yeasts, which have not been touched by the antibiotics, and therefore they can have an overgrowth, and that's where we many times come up with a candidiasis or a yeast infection. Travel can certainly change that, because when you go to another area, you have other types of bugs that are there that you are certainly being exposed to. Immigration, again, just like travel, you're moving to a different area and therefore are exposed to different things that your immune system may not have encountered before and have not been tuned to help weed out of your system. Microbial resistance as well. When we're talking about these bugs that you may not have been exposed to, how about the bugs that you have been exposed to, but they are changing? Well, you have evolving to be able to respond to these toxins in different ways, and therefore they are surviving some of the things that have normally knocked them out, and therefore most of us have put ourselves at intestinal risk or intestinal infection at different times, and of course in this day and age that seems to be increasing more and more. Of course, also with travel, an infectious disease that is raising up in one country, it can be a matter of hours before it's introduced into this country as well. And so we also have to look at those kind of things, that it's a danger of today's lifestyle in this ever shrinking world. Dr. Lala?
Interestingly, we're going to begin looking at some slides here of the gastrointestinal system and how it functions. And as they bring up that first slide, it's going to be kind of interesting. Let's say that today our crew here that records these television shows, somebody is going to eat chicken salad sandwich. I know some of the people are going to have salad, a green salad. Some are going to have a beef sandwich. Some are going to have a tuna salad. Now, as soon as I mention that, and as soon as they begin to think about the sandwiches that they're going to have for lunch today, their brain or their innate intelligence says, gee, my body needs to begin to manufacture and secrete enzymes to begin breaking down those foods. So as soon as you think of a food that you're going to eat, your body begins to produce those or secrete those enzymes. So if let's say it's going to be a candy bar, well, the body is going to secrete, or anything with carbohydrates in it, it's going to begin to secrete in your mouth salivary amylase. So digestion begins there. And if there's fats or proteins in the foods we're going to eat, that's going to continue down into the stomach. Now, depending on if those foods need acid, then the stomach is going to primarily produce acid in there, hydrochloric acid, different forms of hydrochloric acid, which is going to digest the foods that need an acid environment. And as the food moves on into the small intestine, it's still going to be pretty much of an acid pH, but by the time the food moves on to the far end, the distal end of the colon, then that environment needs to turn to an alkaline environment. So people will think, well, if I'm going to eat an orange is acid, right? Yes, it does have an acid pH, but its effect has multiple levels of effects in that in your mouth, yes, it's acid. In your esophagus or your food pipe, yes, it is acid. In your stomach, yes, it is acid, but as that food is metabolized in the stomach, in the proximal end of the small intestine, it leaves an ash. Everything that we combust or digest leaves either an acid or an alkaline ash. In other words, acid ash would be anything below 5.0. Alkaline would be anything above 7.0. So, in the small intestine, particularly at the distal end, the furthest end of the small intestine where absorption is supposed to take place, we need an alkaline environment. So if somebody comes along and says to you, look, health problems are always caused by alkalinity, a high pH, they are partially wrong in that, yes, we need an acid environment in our stomach and the earlier sections of the small intestine, but at the distal end, the furthest end of the small intestine where digestion takes place, we need an alkaline environment. Therefore, if a person has a health condition or conditions related to alkalinity, I don't want to include with their vitamins or foods, with their vitamins that are alkaline in nature, or, and that would be any of the vitamins, the B-complex vitamins ending in INE, okay? Nor do I want to include foods there that would have the opposite nature. So now they're going to bring the slide back up, and Dr. Jensen is going to take you through your gastrointestinal system.
An interesting relation that we have with food and exposure to food allergies is one, as we travel into the stomach has a particular enzyme called pepsin, which is designed at low pHs or an acidity to dissolve collagen. Now, collagen is what binds our cells together and quite possibly is what keeps the inside contents of a cell safe from digestion at that point, and so therefore the acid is meant to break open these cells to release its nutrients. However, it takes an hour for enough of the hydrochloric acid to be dumped into the stomach in order for that pH to change. Now, let's get into why this is important. That acid is supposed to be the protective mechanism, the first mechanism to destroy these bacteria on the way through our gut. But what happens is if we don't chew our food effectively, it doesn't open up the area for this pepsin to attack, to open up the cell walls so that the acid can destroy these bacteria or whatever. It's also one of the things is that the mucus that's formed in there is meant to trap these bacteria so that the acid can have its effect on it. Now, if you're taking an antacid and reducing or more alkalizing the stomach, it's not getting to those bacteria. So by taking antacids, you're actually increasing the risk of intestinal infection. Now, as we dump out of our stomach, which is the reddish type organ that you see there, it's covered by a grayish type organ called the liver. You fall into the intestinal tract. And the intestinal tract, it changes all of a sudden to an alkaline pH. And the way that it does that is that the liver dumps into it bile and bicarbonate. And bicarbonate is a huge buffer that changes acid and normalizes it to approximately a neutral pH. But then when the pancreas, which is found right next to the stomach, also dumps in a lot of alkalizing enzymes as well as a lot of alkalizing chemicals. And then you also have glands that are throughout the small intestine that are also putting forth alkalizing chemicals to change that pH to a point that those enzymes can start to break apart all the food supplements, not the food supplements, but the food constituents of nutrition. I mean, we do want them to break apart the supplements as well for absorption, but that's its primary thing. And then what we have is we're talking also about whether you see these pictures to the side. The top one is showing the inside of the intestinal tract. And as you get closer to it, it starts to blow up in the next picture where you have all these folds. And if you took those folds and spread them out for the entire intestinal tract, you would end up to have an area approximately the size of a football field in the small intestine. That's a lot of area for the absorption of nutrition. As you get down even further, you see that they have these little hairs. This is the third one down that's outside of it that will push food along and push it close to a cell. And as you get to the bottom picture there, you're seeing the individual cells. Now, those cells are called enterocytes, and they're glued together in between them so that you have food stuff that is not completely digested that foodstuff ideally will not go between those cells and get introduced into the bloodstream, but will have to travel through the cells and be packaged appropriately. What happens when we have an infection is that we can get an inflammation in that area, which blows up the area and stretches that connection between the cells, and can even cause holes in there, as well as some of the fungus. What it will do is actually try to burrow itself in, creating more holes to introduce foods directly into the bloodstream. And that's where we get into a huge problem with developing food allergies. Can we go to the next slide?
Well, what we see here, again, one of the things we want to make mention of is that we have a slide of a pamphlet that is really interesting, and it helps. It's called number 111, and it helps us discuss and helps us provide information to you of what we're talking about here. And we basically then have two types of food sensitivities or food allergies. We have what is called an IgE allergy, which is fixed, and then we have an IgG4, which is cyclic. And it simply means that there are foods that we eat that we know that we have allergic reactions to. Those would be the IgE. And there are foods that we eat that, unbeknownst to us, we're having a delayed food sensitivity to. And so, because we all have this individual biochemical nature, even though, let's say, asparagus should be good for everybody, asparagus may be good for you, but it may not be good for Dr. Jensen. And the only way to determine which of those foods is a harmonious food within our gastrointestinal system and which foods are not harmonious towards our gastrointestinal system is through those types of food testing, food allergy testing. And we can test other ways through skin scratching and a few other subdermal injections, but the key is that we check for both, now listen to me, both the fixed as well as the delayed food sensitivity reactions. And anyone who's having gastrointestinal related health issues, without that test, they are being treated with a certain degree of blindness. Because again, to see is to know. And where we have an ability, or we're using the different diagnostic tests to see inside, particularly, and we can go up and scope the intestines and take pictures of the intestines, but the key is that we also go and look at the biochemical activities that are going on in the intestines. So if you're interested in the information we're talking about here, that's an excellent pamphlet to call and order, and there's no charge for it, and nobody's going to try and sell you any vitamins or minerals to go with it. All right, we've got another wonderful slide here now, and it's of the gastrointestinal system, and it's much larger and more in detail now, and Dr. Jensen's going to start up there, I bet you, with the liver at the top of the screen, huh?
At the liver, the primary things about the liver is that it is a detoxifying type of an organ, and it takes care of toxins by many times. What it tries to do is take a toxin and make it soluble in water and packages it so that it can be excreted through the urine. However, what you see below the liver, one of its other great functions is to make bile. And bile and bicarbonate are two of its excretions that change the environment in the intestines, getting it ready for further digestion and absorption by emulsifying fats. That's that little green bulb underneath the liver, and you see another picture of it to the side there, where it's the gallbladder is actually a storage sac for that bile, and will contract upon signals from chemicals released from the stomach to release that bile for the emulsification of fats. If you're looking at that picture to the side, to the left side where you see that green sac, that's a little portion of the small intestine that you see in there, the duodenum, and there's a little bit of a marbly looking yellowness in there, and that's actually the pancreas, which is releasing other digestive enzymes. And that then works through the small intestine, which is that little gnarled kind of like brainy looking organ near the lower right-hand side, and which ultimately then empties into the large intestine that's in the center, almost to the bottom there. And so you have three sections of the intestinal tract there, which is the ascending colon, and then transverse colon as it swings over underneath the stomach over to the right-hand side of your screen. And then as it drops down behind the small intestine there, it has a little S-curve. And it's a descending colon going down to the S-curve, which is called the sigmoid colon, and then empties out through the rectum. Now, one of the things that we need to look at here is if you have an infection, it will change the transit time that you have through the intestinal tract. The intestinal tract will actually change an infection to try to eliminate it faster. And what happens is you have this incredible dumping of fluids into the intestine to put all this nutrients in solution and therefore start to bring it out or suck it out, take out that moisture and the nutrients with it back into the intestinal tract. But if that transit time is too fast, it's dumped all these fluids in there, but hasn't had time to pull them back out with the nutrients because it doesn't want to, because it knows that it has an infection in there. And therefore you end up with very loose stools or diarrhea. And that's what we're talking about. With an infection, you can have many different types of reactions. And here's something that you should look at for yourself. Remember how I was talking about with an infection, one of the first defenses is mucus, in order to trap that infection so that the acid can get at it. Well, that reaction to give off mucus is more of a systemic reaction, which is throughout the body, which can cause you to have full sinuses, okay? It can cause you to have, say, you have to empty it out of your lungs, so you'll have a cough, particularly start to have some asthma or labored breathing type functions. This is how these intestinal infections can relate to you specifically, okay? It's due to bronchial spasms as well. Sometimes it's due to larvae migration. Yes, we're talking about parasites as well, which can then, if it bores in, it can start to try to go to other areas of the body, and oh, we don't want that. Newer research also indicates that intestinal infections can manifest as autoimmune diseases. And now autoimmune diseases would include things like arthritis or skin disorders, such as when you're starting to have that eczema or rashes on the skin. Many people have that, and they try to put creams on it and so forth. Things just don't seem to work. Well, the thing is that your skin as well as your lungs are also detoxifying organs. One of the main detoxifiers is we get rid of our gaseous toxins through exhaling. And so that breathing can help that. Now, one of the problems is that mucus formation is actually acid forming in the body, in which not only inhibits breathing because oxygen is a huge alkalizing factor within the body, but these infections, they like an acid environment, not the acidity of the stomach, but a more acid environment, more of a gently acid environment in order to really proliferate. So this is a way in which they've changed your physiology to help them grow more, okay? They're making the environment better for them. So what you can have is autoimmune diseases, including arthritis, you know, stiffness in the joints. Many times if you have a meal that you're allergic to, you can have that stiffness that indicates that. Again, the skin disorders like eczema, and we find when we take people off of foods, due to that testing, the IgE and IgG4 testing, that we find what your fixed and cyclic allergies are. It gets rid of toxins. It also helps, all of a sudden their eczema starts to clean up because it's not pumping out those toxins anymore, and the intestinal tract becomes much more healthy so that you're not as challenged to get rid of these infections. Pancreatic disease, in which you're lowering your enzymes and therefore not digesting as well. Chronic fatigue. Many people have chronic fatigue disorders due to this. Okay? Other disorders, previous thought to be unrelated to intestinal health. All of these, people just don't relate those to intestinal health. They think it's something different. But if you change the intestines, you got to recall that your digestive tract is really the center of your being. We're basically a tube for food to go through, and that intestinal tract is the inside area of that tube to bring the outside environment into us, as much as our skin tries to protect us from that outside environment. So it really behooves us to see that really 70% of your immune system follows your intestinal tract. Did you know that? So your body is really geared to try to keep this stuff from happening. But like I said, we put ourselves at risk and we put ourselves at certain weaknesses due to what we're exposed to today. Dr. Lala, how about some further thoughts?
Thank you. We have a couple other slides that we can go through quite quickly here about the gastrointestinal system. Here we see a cross-section of the stomach. Up at the top of the center of your screen is the esophagus, the food pipe, which brings the food down into the stomach, and the stomach, if it's going to do its job correctly, as Dr. Sweetert or Dr. Jensen said a little earlier, it's going to be stimulated by pepsin and hydrochloric acid to move that food through there, okay? And then we're going to look at another slide now. And here we are moving further on into the intestines, and we see here the pyloric valve, which is very, very, very important. And we also see the pancreas, and that again is where Dr. Jensen talked about the pancreatic enzymes, including insulin, being secreted. Now those enzymes are alkaline in nature, and so if you go out and buy any enzymes, it should have both gastric and pancreatic or animal and vegetable enzymes in it. And they're so manufactured that the acid enzymes are released inside of the stomach in the beginning aspects, the proximal aspects of the small intestine, and then the vegetable enzymes, which are more of an alkaline nature, are released on the distal end of the small intestine where their function is most appropriate. Now those plant enzymes they have no function or very little function, if any, in the proximal end of the small intestine. So again, the enzymes that you might bind, just because they're enzymes doesn't mean that they're right, and just because there's enzymes it doesn't mean that they're put together correctly. So we have animal and vegetable enzymes. The vegetable enzymes are designed to work in the distal end of the small intestine. The animal enzymes, which are more acid in nature, they are designed to work in the stomach and the proximal end of the small intestine. So let's look at the next slide then. Here we are, we're seeing the distal end of the large intestine, the rectum, and the anus. And of course, there isn't any digestion going on there, but if the foods that we've been eating are not, or if they're contraindicated to our genetic nature, our genetic predisposition for foods, we're going to have a lot of bowel problems. So what it essentially means is we want to bring up that slide again that we had earlier. I think it was number 114. And this one here is going to tell you a great deal about what we've been talking about here today, about these foods, in that we have foods that we're allergic to and foods that we're not allergic to, and the only way to determine those is through an IgG and an IgG4 blood test. There it is, the combined IgE and the IgG4. The IgE test for fixed food sensitivities, and the IgG4 test for cyclic food sensitivities, and that's the one that's often being neglected. So again, you only have one body, and the better that you take care of it, and the better scientific information and analysis that you have of it, the better health you're going to enjoy.
The Fellowship of the Great Physician, through its School of Health and Healing, provides classes each Thursday evening. The primary focus of these classes is biblically based spiritual health and healing, with a brief teaching on physical health and healing. There is no charge or registration fee for these classes, but a free will offering is received. For further information on the School of Health and Healing, class time and location, or the topics discussed on today's program, contact us at the Fellowship of the Great Physician, in care of Dr. Lala or Dr. Jensen, at 200 Village Center Drive, Suite 100, North Oaks, Minnesota, 55127, or telephone us at 651-484-8455. 8521. Thank you for joining us today.